Good morning, DawgNation. I'm Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by ServPro. We're happy to have you with us. Fun stuff on tap today. Georgia, preseason #1 in the AP poll. That's not unexpected. Also, perhaps not unexpected there as well. A little bit of a growing belief that Georgia might have a hard time staying there. We were just talking about that with some of our video audience on the DawgNation homepage and the DawgNation app a moment ago. History also perhaps working against Georgia as it tries to win another national championship. We'll tell you about why that is today here, there as well. And in addition to that, there was also, I think, a pretty compelling message from Mike Bobo last week about something he'd like to see a little more from Carson Beck. We'll do that. We'll welcome in Connor Riley to today's program, and we're going to have, I think, an outstanding time. So we are really happy to have you with us for it. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by ServPro. And it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by ServPro. Cleaning, restoration, construction.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
So the Georgia Bulldogs were in a customary spot yesterday, ranked #1 in the preseason Associated Press Top 25. We've just gotten very used to seeing Georgia at #1 in a lot of these polls, and I would say that yesterday was also not unexpected to see the Dogs there once again. In fact, let me kind of show you what's after Georgia on this a little bit, because I do think it sets us up for a conversation that we probably need to have here today. So Dogs coming in at #1. You've got Ohio State at #2, Oregon at #3, Texas at #4. Let me pause there for a moment. I still sort of say what I told, I think it was Connor Riley last week, might be true, that for all those years during the 14 playoff, we heard, well, this might be a great year for the BCS because there's only two good teams. In this particular case, the two SEC teams, Georgia and Texas, the two Big Ten teams, Ohio State and Oregon, if we had a 14 playoff with just those four teams, do you think that gets us close enough to sort of knowing who the actual best in the country might be here this year? I guess some of that depends on what you think comes next, with Bama at 5, Ole Miss at 6, Notre Dame at 7, Penn State at 8, Michigan at 9, and Florida State coming in at #10. Another SEC team is 11. LSU's at, 13? So you got, some other stuff going on there. A couple of Georgia opponents also coming in at 14 and 15, with Clemson and Tennessee both wearing a pretty ugly shade of orange. But that's the general consensus on kind of where this is to begin this year, with Georgia on top and a handful of would-be contenders with the Dogs showing up behind UGA. Now, this is one of my favorite things to do. I love preseason top 25s. I love the historical perspective some of this provides. We're going to give you some more of that here coming up in a moment. I love the kind of hot takes and pontificating that kind of comes out on some of this. I just think that all of that is really fun. It's kind of the final remnants of the so-called talking season part of college football before the actual season begins. And so I am truly here for it. It is probably not, though, a huge surprise to you to find out that Kirby Smart doesn't care about any of it, not Georgia being ranked #1 in the AP poll, not being picked to win the SEC, or anything like that. In fact, that was one of the things that Kirby Smart made very clear when he spoke to the media last week to begin things for Georgia's fall camp, the idea that this is not the sort of thing that Georgia pays much attention to. This is what Kirby Smart said about that last week.
Yeah, I don't feel like we're familiar with it because we just don't pay attention to it. You guys are probably more familiar with it than we are in terms of that's the expectation. They're going to start the season top 5, or they're going to be predicted to win the East or West when it was there, or they're going to be predicted to win the SEC. I've never honestly paid any attention to it, and we don't talk about it as a team. So the expectation is we're going to develop and worry about today's day and not really, we don't think about that.
So for most Georgia fans, that's exactly where they want Kirby Smart's attention to be, focused on the task at hand, getting better today and getting ready for the first game and letting the rest of all of this take care of itself. But for the rest of us, as I said before, I think there's a certain interest and intrigue in a preseason top 25, even if we've come to expect Georgia to kind of be #1 in these sort of rankings. Part of this is because we've had the preseason AP top 25 in our life for a long time, or at least the AP poll in itself. This thing dates back to the 1930s. So for all of us in our lifetimes, where you're ranked to begin the season, where you're ranked to end the season, this is just a natural part of the college football fans' language. And there is something I would say sort of special about the preseason top 25 that's probably not matched by any of the other top 25s, in that this one is solely based on people's perception. There is no evidence. There is no recency bias. There is no, we just saw this game, and so therefore once the games start being played, people all kind of have a tendency to sort of move in the same direction. How, like, if you ever go to the beach or something like that and you see, like, the pelicans, they all sort of know how to fly in a pattern. Have you ever noticed this before? They all just sort of fly in a pattern. Instinctively, they kind of know how to do that. I would say that once you get into the year, poll voters, whether it's coaches poll voters or AP poll voters, they have the same instinct for sort of moving in a pattern. If you lose, you drop down. If you win, you move up. That's just the sort of pattern that poll voters operate in. But in the preseason top 25, there's a little bit more room to kind of share your opinion. I mean, opinions can be different, and they all add up to sort of equal a consensus, but it's not quite such an established pattern to begin a season when it comes to the AP top 25. But that doesn't mean there aren't some trends that do emerge based on how people vote on this over the course of a period of years. Some of these are well established. We'll talk more about this later on the show. The idea that there's almost always an unranked team that makes the top 10, almost always a top 10 team that finishes the year unranked. I just think stuff like that is really fun and interesting. But for Georgia fans, the thing that might not quite be so fun and interesting is the fact that, at least using history as a guide, the preseason number one in the AP top 25, believe it or not, has not exactly been a place you want to be if your ultimate goal is winning a national championship. The latest to offer an explanation on this, or to provide a reminder on this, was a guy named Brett McMurphy, who has worked for like ESPN and CBS. He now works for the gambling outfit known as the Action Network, still a pretty big figure on the X platform on social media. And he posted yesterday a word of warning to preseason number one Georgia. Brett McMurphy saying, Godspeed to number one Georgia again. He says that, and this is an interesting stat, 18 of the last 20 AP preseason number one teams have failed to win a national title, including Georgia last season. Only 2017 Alabama and USC in 2004 overcame the preseason number one jinx. Everybody else has failed to win the national title. Now, let me tell you this as a quick aside. There is nothing more sports media guy, and I probably fall prey to some of this kind of stuff too, but there is nothing more sports media guy take than we, those of us who give our opinions about stuff like this, constantly get it wrong, and then we blame you for having gotten it wrong. Number one is jinxed because we all got it wrong, as opposed to we're just not very good at picking the preseason number one team. Has it ever occurred to these sort of, fancy erudite writers that perhaps they're just not very good at picking the preseason number one? There isn't some sort of jinx. There isn't some sort of superstition. There's just a bunch of people who are using faulty logic about who they place at number one. Has that ever occurred to anybody who's, doing the AP poll voting, that perhaps this isn't the work of superstition, just the work of insufficient football knowledge? Maybe it has, maybe it hasn't. I'm not exactly sure. But either way, I do think it's a sort of a fair question and perhaps an interesting conversation for Georgia fans to have of, well, how come so few preseason number ones seem to go on and win the national championship, given the fact that, once again, Georgia is a preseason number one again this year? How come so few preseason number ones actually go on to win the national championship? And I looked at this a little bit, and I think that it kind of creates a little bit of an interesting conversation for us. First of all, now, when I say I looked at this, I didn't have time to go back and do 20 years worth of this, so I just looked at the last 10 years, which is the college football playoff era, looking at the 10 preseason number ones from the Associated Press in the college football playoff era. Let me tell you one of the things I thought was kind of fun about this. How come the media gets this wrong so much? Well, first of all, you can make a case that the media has just picked Alabama too frequently. Because in the college football playoff era, Bama was the preseason AP number 1 5 times. But of the 5 times they were the preseason number 1, they only won the national championship in one of those years. So how come the media always gets it wrong? Well, too much picking of Alabama would seem to be the first reason why here. But the more important reason, and perhaps the biggest explanation, and I think you would also see this if you started looking back even more decades, the real reason why the AP poll voters almost always get the preseason number 1 wrong in terms of who actually ends up winning the national championship is the people who voted in this poll just have a nasty habit of picking last year's national champion. But you guys know this. If all we had to do to decide who the new winners were going to be is look at the old winners, we'd all be rich, right? I mean, we'd all be able to pick stocks. We'd all be able to, bet on games. If all we had to do to sort of figure out the future was look at the past, well, everybody would be, a billionaire if that was the case. But there's a reason why, if you watch the TV commercials, past results not indicative of future results, past performance not indicative of future results. Apparently, the AP poll voters never got that little disclaimer that just because you saw this team win the national championship a year ago does not mean they're going to win the national championship here right now. Because in the college football playoff era, we only had one instance of a back-to-back national champion. In the previous BCS era, am I right to say we only had one back-to-back champion during the BCS era as well, that being obviously Alabama in 2011 and 2012. And yet, nonetheless, in the college football playoff era alone, AP poll voters voted last year's national champion as the preseason number 1 7 times. And in those 7 instances, including, by the way, Georgia last year, but in those 7 instances, nary a time did that team actually go on to win the national championship. So the main reason why it's, at least historically, not been good to be the preseason number 1 is not necessarily because it's some sort of superstition or some sort of jinx. It's because the people who vote for the AP poll have a tendency to sort of rubber stamp last year's results for the upcoming year, despite the fact that almost never happens. So there you go. If you're a Georgia fan, I don't know that you necessarily need to be all that fearful of the trend against preseason number 1s, because the trend of being a preseason number 1 seems to be heavily inflated based on what happened the previous year, as opposed to just some sort of analysis of what's set up to happen in this current year. But let me take some time to make one more point about this. Looking at Georgia a year ago, for instance, we said this a lot during the season. Now, we ultimately got last year wrong because we said that Georgia would win the national championship, and obviously the Dogs didn't. So big picture-wise, we got that wrong last year. But there was one thing about last season that we did get right in relationship to Georgia. What we said was, it's almost like, the O.J. Simpson book that I guess he wrote but never released, If I Did It, Here's How It Happened. We kind of had our version of that with Georgia, that we thought that Georgia would win the national championship, but if they don't, here's how they won't. That was sort of our thought on Georgia a year ago, that it was far more likely that Georgia wouldn't make the college football playoff than it would make the playoff and get knocked out by somebody in the play. We thought that was far more likely that if somehow Georgia could be excluded from the playoff, that if the committee had an excuse for leaving Georgia out, they probably would, and that would be the far more likely reason that Georgia would not win the national championship. Ultimately, that turned out to be true, that Georgia, for the most part, played at a national championship level for 13 games a year ago. They came up 1 field goal short in 1 game, but that was still a season in which Georgia clearly played at a college football playoff level, and, no one exceeded Georgia's level of play during the regular season, so Georgia essentially played at a national championship level, but there was a reason to exclude the Dogs from the playoff. That happened, and therefore Georgia had no chance of winning the national championship after all of that was said and done. This year, that's just going to be a lot less likely to occur. This year, we have a 12-team playoff, and as we were talking about Joel Klatt the other day. You remember this? The Fox analyst who was making his case for Ohio State and not Georgia being number 1. But even with Klatt kind of giving a little bit of a skeptical take on Georgia, even in the midst of that, he still said it is almost unforeseeable that Georgia won't make the college football playoff. Almost unforeseeable that the Dogs won't get into the playoff. Even with 2 losses, perhaps even with 3 losses, this is still a playoff team, which if you're a Georgia fan means that somebody's got to beat you on the field to end your season. That's a really big deal. Last season we would say that, when it came time for the college football playoff selection to occur, that Georgia was a justifiable and reasonable selection. They just weren't taken. That ultimately Georgia's season was not ended on the field by Alabama. It was ended in a boardroom in Grapevine, Texas. You can make a case to a certain extent that happened in 2018 there as well. I think the argument in favor of Georgia then was probably a little bit less forceful than it was this past season, but nonetheless, you had guys like Kirk Herbstreit on TV at the time making their pitch for Georgia being a part of the playoff in 2018. In other words, there was a perception among some that Georgia's season wasn't ended on the field, it was ended in the boardroom. Well, this year, Georgia's season, unless something goes terribly wrong, is not going to be ended in a boardroom with a bunch of people sitting around a table deciding who's supposed to be in. You're going to have to beat Georgia on the field to send them home, which I do think creates an opportunity for UGA. Now, it's also fair to point out, of these other preseason number ones that I was talking about a moment ago, most of them played at a playoff or a national championship level only to be beaten by someone who just played a little bit better. So that could also happen for Georgia there as well. I'm talking about, a Florida State team in 2014 that still made the playoff, just got beat. An Ohio State team in 2015 that only lost one time all year long, but ultimately lost when it mattered. Bama in 2016 got beat by Clemson. Bama in 2018 got beat by Clemson again. Clemson in 2019 just ran into Joe Burrow and LSU. Most of these teams that were preseason number one played at a high level. They just bumped into a team that was better. That could still happen for Georgia here this year. But I would say there's never been a better year to be a preseason number one than the one we have here right now, simply because it creates more opportunities for that team to avoid the loss, to shake off perhaps a, sort of a rough moment during the season and still be very much in contention for their chance to win. That could be working in Georgia's advantage. But the overall bottom line is this. I don't think if you're a Georgia fan, you got to be scared by the fact that, history is working against Georgia. AP poll voters, and the jinx of being the preseason number one. I think this speaks to faulty logic of those who are doing the poll voting more so than it does some sort of deficiency about the team who's actually ranked as the preseason number one. Georgia is number one for a reason right now because despite a very tough schedule, no one has more talent. No one has a more proven track record in the sport right now of being able to win big games. That's a recipe for being number one, not just to begin the season, but perhaps to end the season as well. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by ServPro. We are happy to have you with us, no matter how you get to us today, live on video, 10 a.m., radio app and Sports Radio 960 The Rep, podcast all over the place. Just really, really happy to have you as a part of the program here today. And so thankful to our friends at ServPro who make it all possible. And, I was kind of wondering, we always talk about the restoration specialists of ServPro. I was thinking this week, because, I was moving. It's like, this isn't a fire, damage. This isn't like some sort of water main break or something like that. But if I just called ServPro and said all this stuff is damaged, would they just come clean this up and get this out of my house and let me sort of start fresh and new somewhere else? I have to admit, that thought did cross my mind as I was just looking for some sort of solution for the arduous task that is moving. But for many of you, your task is a lot more difficult than that because you have had damage to property that you own, whether it's the home you live in or the place where your business is located or whatever. And if you've had, a fire break out or water kind of sort of break through the pipes and seep through everywhere, well, you know what a mess that is. And you do want it put back together like it never even happened. That's what our friends at ServPro are all about. As I said before, they are restoration specialists. They specialize in restoring your property to its previous condition. And that is a unbelievably valuable service if you find yourself in need of it. Of course, each and every ServPro franchise independently owned and operated, which means they are fully committed to making sure you have a satisfactory outcome when you reach out and get to know them. So please find them online. It's servpro.com, S-E-R-V, servpro.com, for a lot more on that today. All right, we've got Connor Riley here coming up in a moment. Also some interesting stuff on Carson Beck coming up here in just a moment there as well. Before we get to that, though, let me give you a couple of reminders. Y'all, the season is essentially here. We're like post, kind of like the camp part of Georgia fall camp broke this past weekend. That means they're not staying in the hotel. It's almost like you see with, like, if you watch Hard Knocks in the NFL, they're not staying in the hotel anymore. They're getting ready to start classes. They're getting ready to start preparing for Clemson. That the actual season as we know it and understand it is essentially here, which means it's time for you to make your preseason plans for what you're going to be doing during the season. That means being a part of our big Dog Nation Invasion event to kick off the year there as well. Y'all know we are going to be right there, just a few steps away from Mercedes-Benz Stadium for our first Dog Nation Invasion event of the year, our season kickoff event, powered by our friends at ATL Sports Trips. And you know it's a breakfast-themed event because it's a noon start against Clemson. That means sausage and bacon and muffins and pastries and all that, but also mimosas and Bloody Marys. Now, if you want like the regular beer, wine, of course you can get all that there as well. But we're really fun, kind of a breakfast theme for our tailgate this year because of the early start against Clemson. And the first 250 to sign up get one of those really cool Dog Nation Invasion t-shirts. One of the most fun ones of those we've done here in a little while. So I want you to go to DawgNation.com/tailgate, secure your tickets while supplies last to make sure you're guaranteed one of those Dog Nation Invasion t-shirts. Also, keep in mind our friends, and by the way, you see a look there at the Dog Nation Invasion t-shirt. How cool is that? Breakfast of Champions for the game against Clemson with the national championship trophies looking good there and the Bloody Mary, the mimosas. It's such a cool thing. Really great design. We had a great team of folks who are working hard on that, led by Casey Dunn, who always does such a great job. So that is always a lot of fun. And if you want to kind of plus this experience, how about our friends at Atlanta Sports Trips, working in partnership with Discover Dunwoody to give you the VIP hotel experience on Friday night? You can stay right here in the Dunwoody area. Wonderful spot with plenty of shopping and restaurant options, and the VIP experience, which give you a one-night stay the night before the game at the Hyatt Place Perimeter Center. And then we're going to do round-trip transportation for you from the hotel right to the tailgate. You don't have to mess with parking. You don't have to mess with driving. It takes you right to the tailgate. You're there for the Dog Nation Invasion. You get the Dog Nation Atlanta Sports Trip swag bag, which is going to include one of those Dog Nation Invasion t-shirts, of course. You're going to enjoy the game, and then luxury motor coach your way back here to Dunwoody after it's all said and done. So go to atlantasportstrips.com to learn more about all of that. So cannot wait for the game against Clemson. Going to be a ton of fun with our Dog Nation Invasion tailgate and our VIP experience the night before with our friends at Discover Dunwoody. Please go to atlantasportstrips.com, Dog Nation Invasion /tailgate to find out more about all of that. Okay, so before we get Connor Riley, let us now get ready to go around the doghouse here today. And always fun to go around the doghouse, presented today by our friends at Georgia Safe Retirement Planners. And if you go back and watch, and listen, I have to be candid about this. I love hearing from Georgia coaches. And I do love the beginning of the season because that's typically an opportunity to get sort of a state of the offense or a state of the defense from, we heard from Travaris Robinson and Glenn Schumann. On the offensive side, we heard from offensive coordinator Mike Bobo and tight ends coach Todd Hartley. And I'm always grateful to hear from these coaches because we don't hear much from them. In the case of T-Rob, Hartley, great personalities. In the case of Schumann, Bobo, guys who are obviously, so sharp at their craft. It's really fun and valuable to hear from these guys. But if you listen really, really closely, especially this past week, if you listen really closely, one of the things you do conclude, there's not always tons of specific information we're given in situations like this. There's a lot of generalities and kind of generic speaking. You'll notice that if you listen closely. And obviously in a show like this, the more specific stuff sort of works better. So something that Mike Bobo said did strike me as pretty specific. It's pretty straightforward. It's kind of cutting to the chase. He was asked a question about where, and by the way, a year in which Carson Beck could be the Heisman Trophy winner, could be the number 1 overall draft pick, could set records. This is a year in which Beck has a ton of expectations, as you well know. Where can Carson Beck still improve? And Mike Bobo gave a pretty specific and relatively measurable answer to the question of where he'd like to see some improvement from Carson Beck. I thought it was interesting enough that it's worth playing for you on the show here right now. So let me let you hear Mike Bobo talking about Carson Beck, and then let me tell you what I think about this. This is from last week.
But I mean, one, he does a great job of processing, getting the ball out quickly, and I don't remember what his completion percentage was. It was extremely high last year. The one area, that we addressed in the spring and at the beginning of fall camp is, the deep ball, and not necessarily the deep ball doesn't necessarily always need to be the perfectly thrown ball when you hit the guy in stride. Sometimes we want it to be that way as a quarterback, but it's a lot just giving the guy a chance. Not throwing the ball so far we don't have a chance, or throwing it out of bounds. Give the guy a chance to make a play, and he's done a better job of that. And every time we complete a deep ball, it's he's looking at me or looking at Coach Gummy, because he knows that's what he's focused on, giving those guys a chance. And then sometimes when you struggle hitting something or doing something as a quarterback, you start to aim and you're thinking about it too much. Take your drop, read your progression, throw the ball, and play football, and not get in your head of, I can't hit it, I'm trying to aim it or throw the perfect ball. Throw it and give the guy a chance.
The Gummy there, Coach Gummy that Bobo referenced, many of you know, that's Montgomery Van Gorder, the son of former Georgia defensive coordinator Brian Van Gorder, a guy who was quarterback at Buford and kind of a rising star, I think, among the support staff there for UGA, obviously working very closely with the quarterbacks. I think that's interesting from Mike Bobo there. And I think a lot of Georgia fans really like that, because I think the thing that Bobo says that he's pushing Beck to work on, and the thing that Bobo says Beck is pushing himself to work on, is something fans believe they've seen with their own eyes. Fans would tell you, man, Carson Beck had a great season, but boy, how much better could it have been if he'd connected on this deep pass against so-and-so that seemed to be just a little overthrown, or this deep pass against so-and-so that seemed to be maybe just a little bit off target. That there were a few moments that you can go back anecdotally and recall and say, if that had been a little bit different, things, for Beck could have been even better a year ago, and, perhaps that is the case. However, to kind of add to this more than just the anecdotal thing of, I remember this game where this happened and that game where that happened, statistically, if you look at this, it sort of tells a kind of similar story in terms of relatively long passing plays for Georgia a year ago. That if you look at passing plays of just 10 or more yards, what you see is a Georgia team that was among the very best passing teams in the entire country. Last year, Georgia was third in America in passing plays of 10 or more yards. They had 170 passing plays of 10 or more yards, third best in the country. So well established here that almost no one was throwing it better than Georgia was last season. But as you start to look at longer passing plays, Georgia's spot in the national rankings does start dropping just a little bit. For instance, if you change what you're comparing it to like, say, passing plays of 20 or more yards, Georgia's still pretty good. They had 65 of those, but that 65 was only good enough for sixth best in America. So third best when it comes to passing plays of 10 or more yards, sixth best when it comes to passing plays of 20 or more yards. And when you look at passing plays of 30 or more yards, Georgia's national rank sort of drops again. Now they're just 12th best in the country, which is still really good and well within the 90th percentile of teams overall. But once again, compared to Georgia's high standard, sort of dropping a little bit as the passing plays get longer. And I would tell you this, if you start looking at like passing plays of like 40 and 50 yards, that gets to be a little wonky. That gets to be a little random. Like the teams that were throwing the most 50-yard passing plays a year ago were not the best football teams and not the best offenses overall. I would say the 30-plus yard mark is a pretty good place to stop if you're looking for what a really effective offense is. And Georgia was a little less effective with long passes than it was with some of the shorter passes a year ago. That stat sort of tells you that. So the idea that in very specific terms, Mike Bobo says that's something that Carson Beck is working on, I think for a Georgia fan, you kind of find that to be pretty interesting. Because the other really fun thing about that is we can judge this with our own eyes. We can see this for ourselves against Clemson. I'll remind you, it was 2 years ago when Georgia opened the season against Oregon. 7 straight touchdowns to begin the game. Is this Clemson defense on paper right now better than that Oregon defense was? Maybe, but honestly, I'm not quite so sure that Oregon team had some talent. But we saw just how effective right out of the gate that Georgia offense had the ability to be on its way to winning another national championship. A similar display, or at least a display that kind of reminds you of that against Clemson, would be certainly a fun thing to see. And Mike Bobo right there says, looking at what Carson does when he tries to strike deep down the field, that could be one of the interesting ways for Georgia fans to evaluate all of that. And that is Around the Doghouse, presented today by our friends at Georgia Safe Retirement Planners. And speaking of evaluating, And that's what Georgia Safe Retirement Planners does for you. They evaluate your system and situation as you head towards retirement. How much money do you need? And how do you make sure you don't outlive your own savings as you work through into retirement? And how can you achieve all the retirement dreams that you have for yourself? That's what Georgia Safe Retirement Planning is all about. They want to make sure you get that incredibly enjoyable experience, getting your opportunity to make sure you've got all that taken care of. And here is how they do that for you. They're going to offer you a truly free, no-obligation retirement planning service that includes no upfront risk to you. You can gain the peace of mind knowing your financial future is secure. That's a real possibility for you because of the predictive work that Georgia Safe Retirement Planners can do for you to make sure that you're well taken care of. You'll be able to generate potentially up to 50% more retirement income at a fraction of the cost if you were working with somebody else. You don't ever have to worry about outliving your savings in retirement. Because our friends at Georgia Safe Retirement Planners, they know how to accurately forecast your future retirement income up to like 20 years into the future. That's how they're going to take care of you to make sure you achieve all of your goals and dreams. So please find them online. It's GeorgiaSafeRetirementPlanners.com. That's GeorgiaSafeRetirementPlanners.com. So great to have Georgia Safe Retirement Planners as a part of Around the Doghouse here today. All right, we are running very late today, and I need to apologize for that, but let's make sure we pick up the pace here. We'll bring on Connor Riley. We'll get a chance to hear later on from Georgia coach Kirby Smart again today. Obviously, Connor will be all over that, writing for it there at DawgNation.com, and no doubt plenty to say about what's already happened when it comes to Georgia during its fall camp as it continues its preseason preparations and ranked number 1 in the AP Top 25. So let's talk about all of that with Connor Riley here right now on DawgNation Daily, presented by ServPro.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Let's say hello to Connor Riley, DawgNation Daily, presented by ServPro here today. Connor, I know that you're obviously going to be dutifully covering Georgia no matter what you get out of it, but would you join me in saying that while it's always great to hear from Coach Schumann and Coach Travaris Robinson and Coach Hartley and Coach Bobo, always great to hear from those guys, maybe not exactly the most specific information shared in some of what they had to say last week, that their cards were held perhaps even closer to the vest than normal. Was that kind of a fair observation to point out about last week?
Yeah, part of it is really hard because it's the only time we get a chance to talk to them until really Christmas time when bowl season rolls around. And so it feels like you get 20 minutes with these guys and you have to ask these questions. And if you waste it on something specific where they might not give you a great answer, as I think was the case a couple of times, you're kind of just like, well, not only did I not get the answer to the question we wanted, but we don't get to ask further questions because it is a finite resource there. So, it is what it is. I thought there were some things that came out that were interesting, but as far as notes and things on individual players, it's not a surprise to me that those guys played things very close to the chest.
That's why Mike Bobo, speaking openly about seeing better deep ball throws from Carson Beck, that's one that sort of stood out for me a little bit because that is the kind of thing that fans can judge with their own eyes. A lot of Georgia fans sort of feel like anecdotally they had experience with that a little bit a year ago. That's the sort of thing that I do think plays pretty well with a fan-oriented conversation, and it certainly stood out to me, and I think it's interesting that's kind of a challenge that's been given to Beck. Beck, based on what Mike Bobo says, we wouldn't be surprised by this, is also putting that challenge on himself there as well, that fans feel like they could have seen better deep throws from Beck a year ago. And obviously, if he does add that to his repertoire here this year, then truly some of the stuff that you've said for him, being 1-1 in next year's NFL draft, winning the Heisman Trophy, and, kind of having a Joe Burrow-like season, well, obviously all of that gets way easier if he really does connect more on some of those deeper throws, right?
Yeah, he doesn't need to be perfect. And I thought that was the most interesting part of the way that Mike Bobo phrased it. I think there were maybe some times where Carson was maybe hesitant, perhaps, to really chuck it deep or fully unleash it because he knew he had to make the perfect pass to fit it in there. And I think with Georgia's wide receivers this year and tight ends as well, he doesn't need to make the perfect pass and put it where only his guy can get it. they have enough talent around Carson to where they are going to be able to win those 50-50 bowls. There's a reason they went out and got a guy like Colby Young, to where you don't need the perfect pass every time to make a big play. And so I think part of that is a greater confidence gain by being in the Georgia system for another year, working with Mike Bobo, having that starting experience under the belt. There's no new coordinator here this time around, and growing that and giving Carson, I think, more trust and more belief in himself that, hey, like, I know you're a perfectionist and you want to be the best and all the things that come with that. You got to give your guys a chance to make a play. And I think specifically throwing the deep ball, because Georgia does a great job of scheming open the underneath routes and attacking the middle of the field. Those deep balls, there's a reason they have lower completion percentages. It's just because it's harder to pull off. And so Georgia, I think, is aware of that. Carson's aware of that and knows that, hey, like, I don't have to be perfect on every throw, but I do have to give my guys a chance to go out there and make a play on a routine basis.
I want to go back to something you and I talked about a little bit last week, which is that it's obviously a little bit hard to judge this sometimes. Aura points can be a little bit difficult to kind of quantify. But, Carson Beck just sort of taking over the perception of Georgia football and, kind of occupying that mind share. If he's on the way to having the kind of season that has been projected for him, and I said, yourself included, then, not only will we see this kind of stuff on the field, but, he'll also kind of dominate the conversation there as well. We didn't hear a lot of, from Kirby talking about Beck the last time he spoke. You wonder if he comes up more here today, and, you kind of wonder as we get towards the start of the season, at what point Carson, if this is going to happen, becomes sort of an unavoidable topic because he's just doing so much that's just so worthy of remarking over. Maybe that's kind of an unfair standard to kind of hold him to, and maybe it's poorly defined on my part. But, success leaves clues, and if Beck really is about to kick through the door in such a big way, then don't you think there'd be some evidence, and maybe there is some of that, but don't you think there'd be evidence starting to formulate before the season begins that's really about to kind of take shape?
Yeah, it seems like Carson Beck is a bigger deal in sort of the mainstream media than it is around the media of the Georgia program right now. And part of that is because Carson is a known entity. And I think and expect what we're going to get from Carson, what they're going to say about Carson. And we've talked about Carson for so much in the Georgia market up to this point that it's kind of like, all right, we've said all that needs to be said, and we're going to go out there and we need to actually see him go out there and do it on the field. And so with Carson, yes, he is a Heisman Trophy favorite, though it was interesting this summer. You did see Dylan Gabriel surpass him in that regard. And so I think with Carson, again, the big thing is just going to be that game gets here, and that Clemson game in particular. It's a noon window. It's going to be the first game that everyone is watching on the first college football Saturday. And I know there are Georgia fans out there and people that wish that were a night game. I think he's going to have a chance in that first window on that Saturday, I think, to really go out there and put his stamp on this season. And so while, yes, I do think that a lot of people would love to have had that been a night game or a more primetime showing, as well as the fact that it has, I think, been a quieter fall camp from Carson. There's not newness with him. There's not new buzz. It's not like, people getting late to the party about Brett Summer and realizing, oh, this is this whole big thing. No, like we know what Carson is. We know that what he's going to do well. It's not exactly, Cam Newton running people over or exploding onto the scene. He's just going to keep getting better each and every single day. And that's just sort of where he exists right now. And until we actually get a chance to go out there and see it on the field against Clemson, it's hard to just keep hearing about incremental gains after incremental gains.
I don't know if you know this or not, but I love the preseason AP Top 25. I always have. I just am a huge fan of the historical record it gives us year over year about, kind of who lives up to expectations, who didn't quite meet them, and I think the consensus that gets formed either correctly or incorrectly about a given year. Big fan of the AP Top 25. So when it comes out like it did yesterday, I'm always fascinated by it. Why do you think the AP poll voters are so bad at predicting the national champion? As Brett McMurphy pointed out, only done it twice in the last 20 years. I gave my reason a moment ago, but I'm curious, do you have prevailing wisdom as to why they just get it so wrong?
Groupthink, I think, often comes into this, and we so quickly form these opinions right after the last season has ended, and that just sort of tends to hold throughout the course of the year. I bet if you go back and look, and this year it's a little bit later because of the change in coach at Alabama. Like Georgia, Ohio State, Oregon, Texas were probably the top 4 teams in a lot of those January, way too early top 25 teams. And teams change so much over the course of the offseason, especially now so in an age of the transfer portal, where I do think that a lot of that changes quickly. And so, with the number 1 team, it becomes hard. I think it's also a statement of the fact that there are, multiple teams that can go out there and win a national title. And while, yes, only 2 teams in the last 20 years have won from the number 1 ranked spot at the beginning of the season, I believe over that same stretch, only twice has a team not ranked in the top 7 won the national title. So it's sort of a Goldilocks zone that you're looking for there of, sure, maybe you don't want to necessarily be the number 1, but you don't necessarily want to be where, say, Clemson is at number 14 either there. So I think it's, yes, it's hard and it's difficult, but the reality is there's probably like 6 or 7 teams that are truly capable of winning a national title this year. I think maybe this year it might be less than that. I know we've previously talked about, man, this would be a great year for a 4-team, maybe a 5-team playoff. And so I think that's just sort of where it is right now.
You're touching on something I think is really interesting, which is that in football, I think we're really good at, not me so much, but just the people that do this, are really good at putting things into categories, but like a specific opinion's pretty, has almost no value to me. In other words, if you look at the people who do recruiting rankings, they're really good at putting guys into the category of 4-star or the category of 5-star. But as I've told you before, I don't care about anybody's individual opinion of any individual recruit ever, because to me, those are all 50-50 propositions. Is so-and-so player going to make it or not? That to me is always going to be a little bit of a coin flip. But what category should he go into? Historically, the people who do that for a living are very good at doing that. The category of 4 stars, the category of 5 stars. I'd say that when it comes to, poll voting, it's the same type of deal here. Who should be the number 1? Historically, it seems like the poll voters aren't very good at that. But the category of teams that could be number 1, the top 6, the top 7, honestly, the college, football, AP, preseason top 25 voters, they're actually pretty good at doing that, it would seem.
Yeah, and I think it's important to point out here, there's a certain level of maybe foolery that comes with the people that vote on these polls. Because, look, I've never voted on one. I will never vote in one. But, these guys are all covering their own individual teams. And when you're doing that, it's impossible for you to stay at home and watch and synthesize and take in everything that is happening on a college football Saturday. If you're an Ole Miss writer covering that team, odds are you're not watching a ton of Clemson football or vice versa there. So it is, and that's why there are so many voters. They try to get a confluence of opinions. But from an individual standpoint, it is, I think, difficult to really get a grasp on who is the best team there. And so I think that's why they just default to picking Georgia. You saw, I think 2 years ago in 2022, there was a default to pick Alabama because they brought back Bryce Young and they brought back Will Anderson and were maybe willing to overlook some of the structural issues with that Alabama team that ultimately didn't even end up making the SEC championship game. So I think part of it comes down to a groupthink that sort of stems from there. And then once we get into the season, it just becomes hard to really gauge how well some of these teams do. And look, like Kirby Smart will joke about this, about how people go about evaluating football. I like to think that I know a good bit about the game of football, and I recognize I am an idiot when it comes to analyzing the game of football. So take my analysis with a grain of salt. But I also know that there are a lot of people out there in the country that are analyzing things, that are trying to think of things to say about football that also probably shouldn't be doing it.
I could easily research this. I just am not going to. I wonder if the preseason AP poll has gotten better in the last 10 to 15 years as recruiting talk has gone more mainstream. And now the sort of old school minded person who, doesn't understand the role that talent acquisition plays into building a football team. Now that person's been kind of sort of aged out of the conversation a little bit. I wonder if the preseason AP poll has gotten better now that the talent acquisition conversation is just so unavoidable. My hypothesis would be that it probably has.
Right. And certainly in terms of teams that start the year ranked in say, the top 25 and end the year ranked there, obviously there are going to be teams every year that, go from unranked to finishing in the top 10. Missouri did so a season ago. And I'm telling you right now, there's going to be a team ranked in the top 10 that is going to finish unranked this season. Florida State seems like the easy mark. And yes, it's because they're number 10, but because they are so transfer portal reliant. but I could see maybe Alabama first year under Kalen DeBoer struggling there. Obviously, Michigan lost a ton from last year's team and is transitioning to Sharon Moore as the full-time head coach there. A Notre Dame team that is facing a lot of questions right now. And then maybe even, I know you'll like this, I will say Ole Miss, even with a cupcake schedule, again, I think those teams that are so reliant on transfers, I think matters there. And look, there could be haters out there that would want to say, hey, Georgia with that schedule could easily finish unranked. But I think with the way that Georgia has built itself up, and it's the biggest reason, in my opinion, why they're the number one team. And I think you're right in pointing out talent acquisition. No program has recruited better the high school ranks than Georgia over the last 4 or 5 seasons. And I think that's just why, even after losing a player like Brock Bowers, even after losing, an all-time great leader in Cedric Van Pran-Granger, there's just this assumption that this Georgia team is going to reload, because we saw them do it after the 2021 national championship team. And we saw them do it after the 2022 national championship team.
I want to try to squeeze in 2 topics before I let you go. And obviously, I want to be respectful of your time. But the fall camp portion of Georgia's preseason is over. Now you're kind of going to school again and kind of living your own normal, apartments or whatever again. And so now that fall camp is done, is it safe to say that the running back room took home the trophy for most fall camp preseason hype? And I'm not being negative when I say that. I guess I'm saying it sarcastically, but I don't mean it in a negative way. That, buzz about Branson Robinson's return from injury, buzz about Nate Frazier, including a lot of folks talking about him after Saturday, kind of nothing to dispute, what ETN and Roderick Robinson could be. There is a lot of what I would describe positive chatter about the Georgia running back room, and some of this is coming from people who would know, people close to the situation who are pretty impressed by what they're seeing. It seems like this is a pretty fun topic for Georgia fans right now.
It's a total 180 from where this position was, I think, at the start of fall camp, where yes, there is still this question of, is Trevor Etienne going to play against Clemson that day or in that opener because of the offseason arrest? And we won't know that. Look, Kirby Smart will be asked about it. He's going to say what he continues to say on the matter. And we're just going to have to wait to find out until August 31st. But there's also maybe a part of me with, given what we've seen from fall camp, I'm excited to see what we see out of Roderick Robinson in year 2 and the gains that he's made this year. Branson Robinson, obviously, I think he's a guy that's going to play a bigger role at the end of the season, but it's still encouraging for him to have gone out and had the camp that he has had. And then you mentioned Nate Frazier. There's just a different juice with this guy. There's a different speed, a different gear that I don't know that anyone, including Trevor Etienne, in this Georgia running back room can get to. And so I'll be interested to see sort of what Kirby says about him today. I imagine Kirby's going to get asked about Nate Frazier. He's probably going to try and downplay expectations, as is usually the case when discussing a freshman there. But to your larger point, BA, no position group, I think, has changed its perception either positively or negatively greater than what the running back went out room and did during fall camp this year.
All right, last thing for you really quick. When it comes to Georgia defense, I tried my best to listen to people who know more than I do, who are closer to the situation than I am. And I'm just telling you right now, it sort of feels like what I'm hearing is sort of all over the place. Whereas, offensively, whether it's right or not, it seems like the prevailing consensus of what fall camp was can be whittled down to a couple of things. Running backs look good, excitement about, say, Oscar Delton, tight ends. You can kind of whittle it down to a couple of pretty well-established statements. Defensively, it seems like it's a little more all over the place here right now. Is there a definitive statement you think you can make right now about one of the would-be playmakers for Georgia defensively, or a couple of those guys? Is there anything that you've heard enough, consistently enough, that you can say, hey, this is the prevailing wisdom for Georgia on the defensive side here right now?
I think Dalen Everett is going to be very, very good for this team. He's a guy coming out of last season. He admitted it when we got a chance to speak with him at the start of fall camp. He was picked on in part because he was playing opposite Kamari Lassiter. And so, we'll see what they do this year in terms of opposing teams going after either Dalen Everett or Daniel Harris or Julio Humphrey. And there was maybe some prevailing thought that, Dalen didn't necessarily have a starting spot locked up and he was going to have to go out there and compete. Dalen Everett is going to be a big-time player for Georgia in this secondary this year. I don't know if he's going to have a Kamari Lassiter-type season where they just decide to stop throwing at him. But from all accounts, he has had a strong camp and I think gone out there and showed why he was such a coveted recruit, why Georgia flipping him at the eve of signing day was big for Georgia from Clemson, a program he'd probably be starting for this coming up season. So I think Dalen Everett is a guy, that cornerback question, in talking about the secondary at large, everyone felt good about Malachi Starks. But really outside of that, you did have some questions there. And so for Dalen Everett, I think to have gone out and had the camp that he's had, I think provides more reassurance for what he's going to have this upcoming season.
That's a great answer, Connor. I really appreciate that. I'm really glad that I asked it because I think that's interesting stuff. Thanks for being here today. We'll look forward to reading a bunch from you after we hear from Kirby Smart later on this afternoon. That should be a great time. Georgia and Clemson is getting closer, so we'll look forward to talking to you again very soon on DawgNation Daily, presented by ServPro.
Yep, maybe we can talk wide receiver recruiting next time. As always, was a pleasure.
Sounds good, Connor. Thanks.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
A little bit of an inside joke there at the end, but always fun to have Connor Riley and interesting thoughts from him about Dalen Everett. I will tell you this, what I was told is, and who knows, it's like when stuff goes through like the game of telephone, who knows how accurate it ends up being. What I was told is that to begin the scrimmage on Saturday, ones versus ones, it was Everett starting along with Julian Humphrey there at that cornerback spot. And if that's what holds, then, gosh, that's got to be a pretty big statement about Everett because, if you just look at Daniel Harris, he just looks so good. And I think he is good, and I think he's going to be on the field plenty. But holding off a guy like Harris and, maintaining a starting job, if that's what Everett does, that in itself is an accomplishment. So given the chance to talk about anybody defensively, the fact that Connor chooses that time to talk about Dalen Everett, I take that as a pretty meaningful statement. Pretty interesting stuff right there. Now, let's go cruise around the SEC. Courtesy of Royal Caribbean here today, getting you ready for April of 2025, the DawgNation Cruise on board Utopia of the Seas. But as you know, you do not have to wait until April of 2025 to be on board Utopia of the Seas with all of us. In fact, my suggestion to you would be not to wait that long. To go ahead and get your travel planned. The cool thing about this upcoming season is there are 2 bye weeks for Georgia here this year, which gives you a couple of extra weekends to sort of think about, taking some cruise travel, something like that. Or how about early 2025 if you want something for the brand new year? I always enjoy that because when it's really cold here, I love being where it's really, really warm and enjoying all the things that Utopia of the Seas has. They've really kind of, I would say, amplified the pool deck situation, the water slides, and, of course, every single one of these itineraries on board Utopia of the Seas takes you to Perfect Day Coco Cay, which is really important for me because, once again, if you want to have the best of the sort of water experiences that Royal Caribbean has for you, a lot of that going to be found on Perfect Day Coco Cay, either with the largest wave pool there in the Bahamas or the kind of, I would say, newly imagined Oasis Lagoon that's even more relaxing and enjoyable than ever before, or Hideaway Beach, the adults-only enclave, which is so much fun, and then the pool deck itself on the ship that's got the view bar and the rising, the line of coconut and all the fun things there, the water slides on board the ship. Just so many fun things for you to enjoy. In fact, Jessica Slater can tell you even more about that than I am telling you right now. She's a great travel agent, specially selected for us by Royal Caribbean for all of your Royal Caribbean cruise vacation needs. You can give her a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. You can also email her, jslater@dreamvacations.com, and she'll get you planned up for a great Royal Caribbean cruise vacation. So as we go cruise around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean, one more time for those watching on video, can we put the top 25 on the screen again? Because here is where I think things get really interesting. Just like we talked before about the prevailing trend of the team ranked number 1 not finishing number 1, you've also got a couple of other pretty consistent trends. As Connor mentioned, it's teams ranked inside the top 7 that eventually win the national championship. And by the way, when you look at number 7 on this, do you guys remember a few months ago we were doing something? We did like a DawgNation roundtable on DawgNation Daily for a couple of shows. This is when I was out of town. And one of the reasons why I like doing stuff like this is because I like sort of seeing if anything kind of pops up from a trend standpoint. And so I asked several of our DawgNation people about a team outside the SEC that, had a chance to make the playoff. It was very interesting to me how frequently the name of Notre Dame came up. And when you look at some of the statistical stuff involved with Notre Dame, one of the things I'm really big on are teams that are in the top 10 of both points allowed and points scored, top 10 in yards per play allowed and yards per play gained offensively. The only team to make it the top 4 in all 4 of those categories a year ago was Notre Dame. You've got Riley Leonard coming over from Duke. Obviously, they'll have the inside track for the playoff because they are Notre Dame. They don't have to play the conference schedule. Notre Dame at 7 could be a pretty interesting team here this year, and maybe a team that we're guilty of not talking enough about here on this show, maybe more of a contender than we've given them credit for. So the rest of the top 7 be Ole Miss, Bama, Texas, Oregon, Ohio State, and Georgia. A couple of the other sort of prevailing trends that seem to show up is in more years than not, there's a team ranked inside the top 10 that finishes the year unranked. Not outside the top 10, unranked altogether. Who is the best candidate for that here this year? For me, I'd identify a handful here. And perhaps a year like this, they're more than there possibly could be. Let me whittle it down to 2. And I'll give you the last 2 teams in the top 10, starting with the defending national champion, Michigan. I think the vibe around Michigan's pretty strange right now. They've still got some talent left over defensively. This should be a pretty good defensive team. But a lot of the other faces from last year's national championship are gone. A lot of the coaching staff that Jim Harbaugh worked with, it's also gone there as well. This just sort of feels like a fresh new start for Michigan here right now. And maybe Sharon Moore is the guy to lead them into a new kind of a new promised land. But for now, this feels a little bit to me like 2020 LSU, a team that was kind of living as a defending national champion but not offering a very good defense of that title. I sort of feel like we could have some of that with Michigan here this year. I'm not quite so sure how much of a believer I am in the Michigan Wolverines. I would view them as a candidate to finish the year unranked. I'd say the same thing about Florida State. Now, this is not likely to occur, but for the Seminoles, they're pinning a lot of hopes right now on DJ Uiagalelei at quarterback. And no matter how much they try to disregard this, there was something of a statement made in how Florida State laid down and died against Georgia in that bowl game. And you can explain it away any way that you want to. But if you've got a really strong program DNA, you don't get beat by 10 touchdowns. You just don't. And I know that everybody around Tallahassee wants to just sort of disregard that, pretend that it didn't happen, but it did happen. And if you're doing your own personal soul searching, I think you'd probably have to wonder here, is some of what we didn't like after being left out of the college football playoff, is some of that stuff still left over for the upcoming season? And I think for Florida State this year, they may find out that it is. The other thing we often see, Missouri would have been an example of this last year, of a team that begins the year unranked but finishes in the top 10. Missouri last year pulled that off. Who would be capable of doing that here this year? I don't know that I have a great answer for that. That's one of the reasons why it so frequently happens, is because it's somewhat, I guess, difficult to predict who that it might be. But keep your eye on some of these teams who are unranked here right now, perhaps putting together the ultimate surprise and kind of doing what Missouri did a year ago, was getting all the way into the top 10. That's something that we did see. A couple of other stories here really quick. Obviously, one of the things we have not mentioned yet, because it happened last week while I was predisposed, but CJ Baxter, the outstanding running back from Texas, does suffer a season-ending injury, and the Longhorns now left to pick up the pieces at the running back position after his injury. And I'll tell you what this makes me think about. Obviously, in the case of Baxter, we always hate it anytime a player goes down with injury like this, but also for that big game. And Steve Sarkisian, who's such a sharp offensive mind, and I do truly believe that he is, and what they would like to do against Georgia. You got to think, now by the time we get to that game, it's October. We've seen the 2024 version of Georgia play plenty, so perhaps there's new information about Georgia that changes some of this. But as it stands right now, one of the things that you think an offensive mind like Steve Sarkisian might be going after is some of the vulnerabilities that Georgia showed against the run in 2023. And how do you create that opportunity for yourself? Not having Baxter makes that more difficult. Kind of makes me wonder, do you think there's a chance that either in every game this year or specifically for the Georgia game, Could you see some packages for Arch Manning? Because we saw Georgia give up rushing yards to quarterback a year ago. Think about Auburn game on that. Think about Georgia Tech game on that. Running quarterbacks gave Georgia some trouble a year ago. I would say that Arch Manning's probably a little bit more accomplished with his legs than Quinn Ewers probably is. Could we see both those quarterbacks playing significant snaps against Georgia because Texas wants to do something on the ground to attack an area in which Georgia, at least in 2023, showed some vulnerabilities? It's probably not too soon to start thinking about some of that kind of stuff. And then finally, I'll give you this. I saw where Hugh Freeze, the Auburn coach, was talking about his record against Nick Saban. And the thing that probably got Freeze the Auburn job more so than anything was the fact that he beat Saban twice. Beat him in 2014 in Oxford when he was the Ole Miss coach, and then beat Saban in 2015 in Tuscaloosa. Those are the two most significant professional accomplishments for Hugh Freeze in his coaching career. And yet this week speaking, Hugh Freeze was saying that he really should have beaten Nick Saban 4 times. And look, maybe he's right. I don't know. But the thing this makes me think is just how not media savvy Hugh Freeze is sometimes. Freeze has a tendency to sort of say things that are going to be easily taken in the direction that he probably doesn't want them to go. I would say this is an example of that. It kind of reminds me of like before the Georgia game last year when Freeze was talking about how, he didn't really view Georgia as a rival, and there was all this weird stuff that really even kind of bothered his own fans, kind of aggravated them a little bit. He just sort of had an unforced error in how he spoke. To me, this is another example of that. The thing that Freeze has going for himself is the fact that he did beat Nick Saban a couple of times. But when you say you should have beaten him 4 times, sort of turns into a little bit of a fishtail of, well, I had him on the hook, but then it got away, and all of a sudden the exaggeration now diminishes your actual tangible achievements, which is the fact that you did beat Saban a couple times. Now, listen, Freeze knows his way around the SEC, and he's showing that right now. The Tigers have been on or War Eagles, whatever they want to call themselves, they've been on quite a recruiting hot streak as of late. And I think they're set up for maybe even more recruiting success in the weeks and months to come here. So I think the Freeze is starting to find himself a little bit of a home there at Auburn, but avoiding the sort of weird, unforced errors with the media, perhaps the next step for Hugh Freeze. He's always found that maybe a little bit difficult, and maybe this is also an example of that. We'll make that cruising around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. Let me give a couple shots out here before we get ready to go here today, starting with our friends at Mr. Rooter here for a moment. Obviously one of the most important calls you'll ever make is to that plumbing company when you have some sort of, major water issue show up. Well, our friends at Mr. Rooter want to take care of you there on that, offering whole home water filtration, drain cleaning and repair, and work on your water heater, and so much more. They're dedicated to addressing your plumbing needs as quickly as possible, both residential and commercial, everything else in between, all day, every day. You can always rest assured you can count on Mr. Rooter for upfront pricing, flexible service options, and exceptional customer service. Plus, there's a $29 service fee that's waived anytime you get some repair work done. So you can find your local Mr. Rooter online at MrRooterGeorgia.com. That's MrRooterGeorgia.com. Let me also remind folks while I have a chance to here that you can still register for your chance to win our Sip and Swing contest, courtesy of the Finish Long Drink there as well. Go on to Instagram or the X platform. Use the hashtag Sip and Swing. Tag the long drink, tag DawgNation, but use the hashtag Sip and Swing, and you could be playing golf with me coming up in the month of September with the Finish Long Drink flow in there that day. Plenty of beverages, plenty of fun, and a whole lot of good, not quite good golf, but good times playing golf, at least when it comes to me there on that. So use the hashtag Sip and Swing, and perhaps you could have a chance to have a golf outing with DawgNation, courtesy of the Finish Long Drink, and hope you'll do that as well. All right, as we get ready to sign off for a golden shoe, we've got great news today for one of our own. So happy to see this. Jake Fromm is back in the NFL once again. As was reported by DawgNation yesterday, the Detroit Lions have signed Jake Fromm in the midst of a flurry of other roster moves. But Fromm on his way to Detroit to be a part of the Detroit Lions. There was an injury, I guess, to former Tennessee quarterback Hendon Hooker there in Detroit. So that may be the opportunity that Jake Fromm is looking for. Obviously, we're never happy about an injury, but obviously happy for some good fortune here for Jake, getting a chance to show what he's all about. A year ago, Jake played tremendous in the preseason. Really, I thought deserving of a roster spot. and now he'll get a chance to maybe do some of that again. So obviously we wish him well. Last year while he was with the Commanders, he still showed up on DawgNation Daily each and every week. My hope is he'll still do that with us here right now. But at the very least, happy to see Jake on his way to the Detroit Lions. Congratulations to him for that. Lousy, stinking Gators, nothing to congratulate them for. Been a long time since they've beaten Georgia. It's 1,375 days. That is our Gator Hater Updater. And we will look forward to seeing you back here tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by ServPro. We will look forward to talking to you then. And on video, time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews, the one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price is promised. That is what R.S. Andrews is all about. Getting you cool and comfortable as it is so hot outside. Certainly the Lord's work being done by them on all of that. So let us do this. Let's get your comments. I'm going to start on Facebook here today first. We'll kind of bounce around through a lot of these. We'll see what's on your mind here as the Georgia Bulldogs get closer to the start of the 2024 season. So let's find out what you got going on here just for a moment. I'm going to tap dance here while the comments load up and open up, and hope everybody's good here today. And we're getting ready to go. Any moment now. There we go. Keith Folds, happy for Jake Fromm. And Keith, I'm glad to see you saying that and doing that. Jacob O'Neill says, ready for those Corky Kell Classic games tomorrow. Yeah, we're really excited. Great doubleheader at Kell High School tomorrow. Obviously, our Friday game involving Rome had to be canceled, unfortunately, because you may be aware of the horrific bus wreck involving the Rome team after its scrimmage last week. We certainly continue to keep Coach John Reed and his program in our prayers there on that. But I think two really fun competitive games tomorrow. Getting a chance to see one of the all-time great programs in Georgia, LaGrange, in the Corky Kell Dave Hunter Classic for the first time. Tomorrow night they'll take on Douglas of Atlanta. Obviously that's the Georgia commit Jonte Gilbert. But a lot of you may not be aware of this. Many of you are. That Billy Napier's brother is the LaGrange coach. He's done a really good job there. The Napier family has a long-standing history in Georgia high school football, going back to Murray County, and obviously their father, who was a beloved figure up there. I remember when Billy Napier was hired as the Florida coach, there were a lot of Georgia fans who would reach out to me on social media or in our comment section here, and they were like, listen, I'm not going to be able to say anything bad about Billy Napier because I love, Coach Napier and what, he stood for, up there in the north part of the state. Unfortunately, Coach Napier passed away in 2017 from ALS, but this was a beloved figure. And obviously, Billy Napier's brother now at LaGrange, kind of keeping that Napier legacy alive here in the state of Georgia. And I mean that with all due respect. He was a longtime offensive coordinator with a terrific Callaway program, who's also, by the way, involved in our Corky Kell Dave Hunter Classic. So a lot of you will kind of see a little bit different side of the Napier family. You kind of know Billy Napier as the guy we sort of, take some shots at every now and then as a part of the Florida programming, sort of good-natured fun with the Georgia-Florida rivalry. But a beloved family in Georgia high school football circles. And Coach Napier's brother, they're leading the LaGrange program. And this was a lot of people don't realize, but LaGrange was the second winningest team in Georgia history. Won 3 straight state championships in the early 2000s, have not been nearly that good for the most part since then. But in the previous 4 years for Coach Napier, they have been showing improvement, winning 8-9 games with regularity, making the playoffs, and now from their standpoint, hoping to take that next step on that. So you got that. And then you got, speaking of Callaway, on Friday we'll also see Callaway and Cass. That'll be a lot of fun. Of course, life without Sokovia White for the Cass Colonels. And then tomorrow night, also a really interesting matchup as, North Atlanta and, tremendous edge rushing prospect kind of, on the sort of the radar for Georgia fans against a Kell team that's always high-powered on both sides of the ball. Should be a really interesting first couple of days here. And then obviously that leads into Mercedes-Benz Stadium there on Saturday. Kent Holcomb says, I'm starting to wring my hands in anticipation of the upcoming season. Been a long wait. Yes, it has been, Kent, but it's almost over with. You love that. Let's see what else. Miriam Corbin, also happy for Jake. I am there indeed. Gary Holt says, I think that Kirby is going to rotate our boys a lot and try to keep everybody fresh. This is going to be a tough schedule, so to predict anything about what's going to happen would be a waste of good air. LOL. So as far as like the rotating and the things like that, Kirby talked about this the other day about, they play to win, they want to get some experience. And I think this was that press conference. I think I can't remember if this was media days or that press conference to kick off fall camp. But I do remember thinking about it, that there were a couple of different ways that could be taken. In other words, obviously Georgia does like to play a lot of guys, and I don't believe this year will be any different there on that. But I do think there's a way to take what Kirby Smart said the other day, especially when it comes to certain positions, as when Georgia has a chance to win a game, I don't think they're going to mess around very much. Georgia's always had a little bit of a proclivity for wanting to kind of get in and get out and get on with their life. I think there may be even more of that from Georgia here right now, where, when they have a chance late, third quarter, fourth quarter, to kind of, put the game on ice, and what do people call it, like the March of Doom or, Death March, whatever they talk about from Kirby Smart. We may see even more of that now than before, because if Georgia has a chance to shorten a game and end a game, even if it's not always the sort of prettiest thing, I think we may see some of that from Georgia on that. Let's see what else. Jamie Huff says that Beck can win the Heisman if he fixes the deep ball, and so we'll see if there is more of that, from Beck here this year. Al Chandler says you want to have a leave no doubt mindset. I think that's true, but I think from Kirby Smart's perspective, it may be. And this is just me speculating. I obviously don't have any, no one can know what's inside of anybody's head. I'm just speculating my best guess here. But the notion of leave no doubt may be more about, hey, by winning all these games, we're proving that nobody's better than us. So if we only beat so-and-so 31-13 as opposed to 63-13, then so be it, because we're trying to play to win week to week to week to week, and we're going to do what it requires to get that done. Now, as I said before, this is me speculating on what could be true. Obviously, I can't guarantee any of that. But if playing too many guys too frequently makes games longer than they should be, my guess is they may do a little less of that this year, but that's just my best guess. Jacob O'Neill says, I just hope we stay healthy this year. No doubt that's the hope of and wish of every Georgia fan for sure. Let me go over here to the DawgNation YouTube page for a moment and find out what's on people's mind over here. JT says he can see Jalen Milroe getting frustrated with playing time. I should say play calling in Alabama and Shogun on the sidelines. Look, I've said this before. I think the relationship between Jalen Milroe and Kalen DeBoer could have many layers to it by the time this year is done. This may be a magical pairing, but I do believe that Kalen DeBoer probably has some thoughts about the Alabama quarterback situation that he's not yet revealed. If I had to guess, there's perhaps some of that going on. Paul Moon says we need to fluster Jalen Milroe this year. Totally agree that Georgia was just, I believe, too deferential towards Milroe a year ago. I definitely think that's the case. Paul Moon says when it comes to the game against Alabama, either way, I just want to leave with one more point than they do. In other words, I just want to win the game. I'm right there with you on that. Only Missed says we won't brutalize Alabama. Yeah, it could be the case, maybe not. I mean, the truth is the closer we get to the start of the season, as I've said before, I guess I'm probably a little higher on Alabama than in terms of what I think they have a chance to do. Good to see Green Soldier in the comment section here today. I love that. Green Soldier also mentioning something we've talked about before, which is, the one spot where Texas is probably the most vulnerable, maybe with its defensive secondary, and that could be an opportunity for Georgia to attack, maybe. Baggins and friends, happy for Jake Fromm, and we are indeed. Curtis Williams shouting out some things he'd like to see a little bit more of. Mike says a lot of outsiders are saying we lost too much in offense, but I'm really excited about our offense this year. Yeah, so I would say that obviously Georgia lost a historic player, and that is not an easy thing to replace. I think that there are plenty of examples of Brock Bowers over the course of the previous 3 years just making certain things with the Georgia offense look a little more put together than they perhaps were. He just sort of covered up a lot of blemishes because he himself was so good. And so obviously with him no longer there, things get a little bit more challenging. I don't think there's any doubt that's true. But at the same time, the pieces seem to be in place for Georgia to also, put together another stellar offense for this season there as well. Because in some form or fashion, whether Beck achieves like the highest end projections for himself or not, this is clearly a quarterback who is good enough. This is clearly a quarterback who is, kind of in the category of sort of best, most accomplished signal callers in the sport. So the building block you need at the quarterback position is obviously in place. The other thing here is, on paper, I think that Georgia get the best offensive line in the country. And everything about cultivating pass catchers and cultivating running backs, all of that is made easier by what you have at the offensive line position. I don't think there's any doubt that's true. Let's see what else. Let's see what else is going on here. A lot of good comments back and forth here amongst our YouTubers here today. Yeah, a lot of strong comments in here. Stick D says in the big games, Georgia needs to be able to not only stop the pass, but also stop the run, a la Alabama. Yeah, I would say that clearly that's one of the things last year that was sort of, pretty surprising. There haven't been very many instances, even on Georgia teams that were far less accomplished than the recent Georgia teams. They were still pretty good against the run normally. There was a portion of 2018 when Georgia had its issues with rush defense, but other than that, that's an area in which, for the most part, Georgia has thrived. But last year, some real problems. So that's the one thing you definitely want to see. You'll be looking for that against Clemson. You definitely want to see, this team, show that ability to stop the run and be better at that this year than they were a year ago, because almost anything else you want to do defensively is made worse when you're giving up those rushing yards. And I used to say this all the time. In games where the score was a little tighter, a little closer than it was sort of supposed to be, was Georgia ever in any real trouble? That was always the first thing I looked at. If the other team was not running the ball, then Georgia was not on upset alert. That the only way you were going to get one of these teams who was like a 3-touchdown favorite to have any shot of hanging around and being in the game for the full 60 minutes, if somehow they were finding some success on the ground. And for the most part, against Georgia, that almost never came. Last year, sometimes that did occur, and obviously we saw Georgia, playing a little closer against a little lower level of competition than what we had been used to seeing certainly the previous couple of years. Jonathan Aaron says, if Pittman loses his job this year, do you think he'll just retire, or do you think he'll coach again, maybe coming back to Georgia? My assumption is that Pittman, who built a beautiful house right there in the lake, he's not one of the highest paid coaches in the SEC, but still makes a good bit of money. My assumption is that Pittman will go enjoy all of that and live the life that he's deserved with perhaps more money in his pocket than he thought he probably would get. Now, listen, do you eventually get restless and sort of get back into it? Obviously, Matt Luke certainly did that. could Pittman eventually get a little restless and like the idea of being back around the sideline again? I guess anything's a possibility, but it sort of feels like, house right there in a state that he loves, extra money in the pocket. At a certain point in time, you became a head coach in the SEC. That's quite a success story in terms of professional ambition. Sort of feel like you would probably just be done, but obviously, I could be wrong, but that would probably be my best guess there on that. Comments that I can't read. Curtis Jackson says, players will come and go, especially doing the transfer portal, but who we can't lose is Kirby Smart. As long as we have him, we'll be just fine. And Curtis, I believe you're probably right about that. Obviously, his leadership of this program has been remarkable. Truly has been. Alan Hampton says, don't worry about the offense. It'll be more balanced with more talented running backs making up for the loss of Bowers. I like that idea. I do. I like that idea for sure. Let me get a few comments here at DawgNation.com. Randy Hall says, early prediction for the Georgia-Clemson score. I need to learn a little bit more about what Clemson's bringing to the table. Obviously, from a Georgia standpoint, I like everything that I expect Georgia to do that day. I probably need to learn a little bit more about Clemson before I make too bold of a statement, but I guess I probably feels like about a 2-touchdown or so win for Georgia for me right now. That's sort of what I'm thinking on that. Ken Holcomb at DawgNation.com says, leave no doubt, but not at the expense of leaving starters in too long when the game is in hand and possibly getting injured. Yeah, I think I may have mentioned this yesterday. One of the things that I believe that Kirby Smart told some boosters on Saturday is that he's perhaps more concerned about the drop-off from starter-level players, number 2-level players this year than any time since he's been Georgia coach. Now, you may say, as one of our commenters said a moment ago, that's why you've got to get these guys in the game and get them experience, which, perhaps is true. But on the other side, shortening games, getting guys out without, making a game longer than it needs to be, also something to keep in mind there too. Now, I guess there's also the thought of, well, all the more reason why you want to get the starter out of the game. But sometimes the best way to keep a guy from getting hurt is not to get him out and put in a backup. It's to keep him in, let the game just get over with, and then sort of move on to the next thing. Probably a couple different ways to look at that, I guess. SEM Dog says, here's hoping that the injured defensive line players get back to full speed in time to prepare for Clemson. I mean, one of the former injured players that I'm hearing good things about right now is Tyrion Ingram Dawkins. That's a guy at the defensive end position that Georgia may be very happy to have. Very happy to have. All right, let me go back to Facebook for a moment. We'll do one more trip around the comments section. Al Chandler says, with our offense this year, we should get enough points on the board to get our second and third string in early several games. Hope to see that be the case. Robin Streetman also predicting a 45-13 win for Georgia against Clemson. Robin, I like that from you. That's good stuff. Always a strong prediction indeed. Appreciate that. Let's see what else. Miriam Corbin also predicts Georgia to win 35-7. So a lot of confidence in the comment section here right now. Back on YouTube for a moment before we say goodbye. Curtis Williams says, they talking about KJ Bolden playing some this year. He says, Dan Jackson is a tough, smart player with a ton of experience, which Kirby Smart values more than talent. Yeah, I mean, obviously what we've heard about KJ Bolden is he's going to be hard to keep off the field. But I guess we've also heard a little bit about the fact that Dan Jackson is a pretty formidable challenger for playing time right now, too. The good news is that something that Georgia didn't always feel like it could do in recent years, which is play like a dime package with 6 defensive backs in the game, maybe now they will feel a little more comfortable doing that. And whether it's, Jackson at safety or Jackson at the dime back or, the same thing for Bolden, that you could have opportunities for both guys to get into the game. Perhaps that's the case. Let's see anything else. Paul Moon says, I feel like a broken record, but the spot I'm the most concerned about right now is interior defensive line. I think that's fair. That group's got a lot to show here this year. Getting Brinson and Stackhouse back, very big deal. Hopefully getting Jordan Hall back from injury, very big deal. The kind of season that Christian Miller's capable of, very big deal. Getting something out of the South Carolina transfer, Xavier McLeod, also kind of a big deal. That defensive line has probably been the spot we've watched the most closely for the offseason. I would say that continues to be the case. All right, let us see. G. Grace brings up an interesting point. Because of the more difficult schedules, he says, I don't see anybody averaging 40 points per game in the SEC. Yeah, that's interesting. In the NFL, 30 points is a lot. In college football, 40 and 50 points has been what we think of as sort of a lot. But, a magic number in the NFL is how close you can get to averaging 30 points per game. It's just a different league, much more competitive. I think there's a point of view in which G. Grace might be somewhat right about that we could see college stat lines perhaps start to resemble a little bit more like NFL stat lines. Although, when you do kind of run up on those mismatches, and there still will be some of them, padding stats there may impact the overall end-of-year numbers themselves a little bit too. G. Gray says he'd start Ellis Robinson this year because he thinks he's special. Well, first of all, appreciate that, G, coming from a non-Georgia fan. And obviously I think Georgia fans are really excited about Ellis Robinson as well. I will say that even for someone as talented as Robinson, given what I think Daniel Harris could be, given what I think that Humphrey could be, given what Connor Riley was saying about Dalen Everett a moment ago, even if you're as talented as a lot of us believe Ellis Robinson would be, cracking that lineup is still a pretty difficult thing to do. So it may be one of the spots where the competition is the most intense right now, and obviously we would assume that Ellis Robinson is a big part of that. But once again, not an easy competition to win. So we'll have to see on all of that. But for now, we're going to get ready to wrap things up for our R.S. Andrews cool down. Y'all make sure you find R.S. Andrews online at rsandrews.com for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price is promised. You can trust them on all of that. And when it's so hot outside, getting your AC unit tuned back up to factory fresh specs, that is what our friends at R.S. Andrews are all about. They'll keep you cool and comfortable all remainder of the summer long, heading into those hot days of early fall there too. And that's what R.S. Andrews is all about. So find them online, rsandrews.com. Somebody may have told you need a new air conditioning unit, but our friends at R.S. Andrews may be able to tell you how to get some new life out of that old unit and get the thing tuned back up to factory fresh specs. So find them online at rsandrews.com. Have a great day, everybody. We'll see you back here tomorrow. DawgNation Daily presented by ServPro. We'll look forward to talking to you then, everybody.